For 38 years, my uncle told this family I wasn't real, that my father's blood, and mine with it, didn't belong. My name is Karen Waller. I build houses in Lexington, Kentucky. Vernon said it so many times, it became family gospel. Karen's not a real Waller. Her daddy wasn't either. And people they believed him. He used that single lie to control my grandmother's land, her house, and every decision this family made. Except Vernon Waller was adopted at 11 days old. My father was the only biological son my grandmother ever had. And the night his wife finally said it out loud in that kitchen, the only sound left was the faucet dripping into the sink. Now, if this story already has you leaning in, and trust me, we haven't even gotten to what Vernon did with the timber rights or what my grandmother hid inside her bedroom closet for over 2 decades, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you don't miss a single part of this. Because by the time Vernon's own wife stands up at that kitchen table, you're going to understand why I say that truth doesn't always come quiet. Sometimes it screams. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I love knowing who's out there. Let me take you back to the summer of 2005. The June my father died, and Vernon Waller decided the whole family was his. So my dad, Dale Waller, he was the kind of man who fixed things. Not in a flashy way. He had this old red toolbox, dented to hell, and every Saturday morning he'd be somewhere on the property with it. Fence post loose? Dad. Water heater acting up? Dad. He finally fixed the screen door on the back porch 2 weeks before the stroke took him. He was 46. I was 19. And I remember standing in that hospital hallway at Baptist Health thinking, I don't know how to do any of this without him. My grandmother, Lenora, everyone called her Nora, she owned 74 acres off Old Frankfort Pike. Horse country. Rolling hills, white fencing, a stone farmhouse she and my grandfather built in 1961. Grandpa Cecil died before I was born, so it was always just Nora and that land. She leased pasture to a boarding stable, kept a vegetable garden the size of most people's backyards, and ran that property tight. Every fence post accounted for, every lease payment on time, every decision hers. Dad was her only child, and I was Dad's only child. So in a normal family, the math would be simple, but the Wallers weren't a normal family. Because there was Vernon. Vernon was, well, legally, he was my uncle. My father's older brother by 3 years. Big guy, loud laugh, the type who'd clap you on the shoulder so hard it stung, but you were supposed to be grateful for the attention. He sold farm insurance out of an office on Versailles Road and acted like that made him the most important man in Fayette County. At my father's funeral, Vernon positioned himself at the front of everything, talking to the pastor, directing the pallbearers, shaking hands at the reception with this solemn nod, as though he'd lost the most. I remember watching him straighten the flowers on the casket, and I thought he was being kind. I didn't understand yet that he was marking territory. I didn't like him. I don't think I ever liked him. But when Dad died, Vernon stepped into the gap, and I let him. And here's the thing nobody tells you about grief. When you're 19 and your whole world just collapsed, you don't question the person who shows up and says, I'll handle everything. You let them. That was my first mistake. Vernon moved fast after the funeral. Within 3 weeks, he had himself listed as the primary contact for the property's insurance, the pasture lease, and the boarding stable contract. He told Nora it was just temporary, that she shouldn't be dealing with paperwork while she was grieving. Nora was 71. She'd just buried her son. She said okay. And I was starting a job at a construction company in Nicholasville, learning framing from a guy named Dell who smelled like sawdust and black coffee and treated me like I had a brain, which was more than Vernon ever did. I figured, Vernon's handling the property stuff. I'll get my career going, and eventually things will settle. They didn't settle. They calcified. By the end of that first year, Vernon had moved his family into the stone farmhouse. His wife, Paulette, their son, Trent, and Vernon himself, all living with Nora. He said it was to help her, and maybe at first it was. Paulette cooked, Trent mowed the lawn, and Vernon paid the electric bill. But it shifted, slowly. Like how you don't notice water rising until your shoes are wet. Vernon started making decisions about the land without asking Nora. He switched the stable lease to a buddy of his who paid $400 less a month. He canceled the vegetable garden plot Nora rented to a local co-op, said it was more trouble than it was worth. He rerouted the driveway and took down the mailbox post my grandfather had welded himself. And whenever I brought any of it up, whenever I said, "Nora, did you know he changed the lease?" Vernon would be there, in the room, with that smile. "Karen, sweetheart, this is family business, and I know you care, but you've got to understand. Your daddy, God rest him, he wasn't exactly a Waller in the way that matters." First time he said it, I thought I'd misheard him. My father wasn't a Waller? Dale Waller? The man who lived on that land for 46 years, who knew every fence line, every creek bed, every spot where the soil went clay? But Vernon kept going. He said it at Thanksgiving that year, right in front of Nora and Paulette and Trent. Dale was a good man, don't get me wrong, but there were always questions about where he came from, about whether Cecil was really his father. Nora didn't say a word. She just looked down at her plate, and I thought she'd correct him. She'd say, "Vernon, that's nonsense." But she didn't. She just let it sit there. And that silence, that was the thing that planted the lie in the ground. Vernon said the words, but Nora's silence was the water. Paulette was clearing plates. She picked up Vernon's dish, and her fingers were pressed so tight around the rim, I thought she'd crack the ceramic. She didn't look at anyone. I left that Thanksgiving early, sat in my truck in the driveway for maybe 15 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, trying to figure out what had just happened. I was 20 years old, and my uncle had just told my entire family that my dead father might not be who he said he was. Over the next several years, Vernon refined that lie the way you'd sharpen a knife. Slow, steady, deliberate. He never outright said, "Dale was adopted," or "Dale was someone else's kid." He was smarter than that. He'd drop little comments. "You know, Cecil and Nora tried for a long time before Dale came along. Funny how that works." Or, and this one was the worst, because he'd say it with this sympathetic head tilt like he was doing me a favor. "Karen, honey, I'm just saying, you might want to look into your own history before you go making claims on this family." Claims. Like wanting to visit my grandmother on her own property was a legal filing. I was building my life during those years. Got my contractor's license at 24. Started picking up renovation jobs around Lexington. Mostly kitchens and bathrooms at first, then bigger stuff. By 27, I had 2 guys working for me. By 30, I had my own LLC, Waller Built, and a reputation for showing up on time, staying on budget, and not cutting corners. I was also married briefly. A guy named Patrick who was fine on paper and empty in person. We lasted 22 months. No kids. He got the couch and the coffee maker. I got my sanity back. But here's what was happening while I was framing walls and filing permits. Vernon was consolidating. He got Nora to sign a power of attorney in 2011. He told her it was just for the bank stuff. She was 77, and her hands shook too much to write checks anymore, so she agreed. I didn't find out about the power of attorney until 2013. 2 years where Vernon was making financial decisions on behalf of a woman whose land was worth, conservatively, $1.8 million. And I'll be honest, there were moments, late at night after a long day on a job site, where I'd look at old photos of Dad and Grandpa Cecil side by side, and I'd think, they really don't look alike. Cecil was broad, fair-skinned, light eyes. Dad was lean, dark-haired, olive-toned, and Vernon's voice would creep in. Dale never did look much like Cecil, did he? And for just a second, I'd wonder. Not believe, but wonder. That's what a lie does when you hear it enough. It doesn't need to convince you. It just needs to make you hesitate. When I confronted him about it, he was standing in Nora's kitchen, eating leftover cornbread off a paper towel. He barely looked up. Karen, I appreciate your concern. I really do. But this is between me and my mother. His mother. He called her his mother. And I said, Vernon, she's my grandmother. Dale was her son. And he set the cornbread down and looked at me. Really looked at me. And said, was he though? 2 words. And he walked out of the kitchen and left those 2 words sitting in the room. I went home that night and I cried. Not because I believed him. I knew my father. I had his hands, his jawline, his habit of tapping his thumb against his knee when he was thinking. But because I realized something worse than the lie itself. Nobody was going to stop him. I pulled back after that. I know that sounds like giving up, but it wasn't. It was survival. I threw everything into Waller Built. I picked up a contract to renovate 3 row houses in the Distillery District. I bid on a historic restoration project in Woodford County and got it. I was working 6 days a week, sometimes 7, and I told myself that the property, Nora's land, would work itself out eventually. It didn't. In the spring of 2016, I drove out to the farm on a Sunday to see Nora. She was 82 by then. Still sharp, but slower. She'd stopped gardening. She spent most of her time in the front room watching game shows and working crossword puzzles. I brought her a quart of burgoo from a place she liked on South Broadway. We ate it on the back porch. The same porch my dad fixed the screen door on. The same porch where I used to catch fireflies in a mason jar when I was 7. And she said something that afternoon that I almost missed. She said, Karen, have you been in my bedroom closet lately? I said no. Why would I be in her closet? She just nodded. Slow. Good. Don't let Vernon in there either. I asked her what she meant. She shook her head and changed the subject to some contestant on Wheel of Fortune who'd just lost $14,000 on a bad spin. But I remember thinking, that was strange. Nora didn't say things for no reason. She was the least random person I'd ever known. If she mentioned the closet, there was something in the closet. I didn't go look. Not then. I wish I had. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been the last person to learn a truth that everyone else already knew? Because that's where this story is going. And it gets worse before it gets better. Actually, let me rephrase. It gets much worse. And then Vernon's own wife blows the whole thing apart. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So that same spring, something else happened. I was at the county clerk's office pulling a permit for a deck build, and I ran into Sheila. She worked the records counter. Nice woman. Always had hard candy in a dish by her computer. And she said, casually, Hey Karen, I saw your uncle was in here last week. Filed some paperwork on that Frankfurt Pike parcel. My stomach dropped. What paperwork? She couldn't tell me specifics. Privacy rules. But she gave me this look. The kind of look that says, you should probably look into this. I went home and pulled up the county records online. And there it was. Vernon had sold the timber rights on the back 40 of Nora's land. 23 acres of mature hardwood, black walnut, white oak, cherry, sold to a logging outfit out of Moorhead for $87,000. The money went to an account I'd never seen. Not Nora's, not the farm's. An account in Vernon's name only. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time that night. My hands weren't shaking. They were still, completely still. And that scared me more than the shaking would have. I drove to the farmhouse the next morning. It was a Wednesday. I remember because I'd rescheduled a flooring inspection to make the drive. Vernon was on the porch, drinking coffee from one of Nora's old ceramic mugs.
the blue ones with the chipped handles. He saw my truck and didn't move. Just watched me walk up the steps like I was a salesman he was about to turn away. "Vernon, you sold the timber rights." He sipped his coffee. "Vernon, I heard you, Karen. And yes, I did. The trees were overgrown. The logging company offered a fair price, and the money went toward property taxes and maintenance, which, last I checked, you haven't contributed a dime to. The money went to your account. I saw the records." He set the mug down. Slow. "That account is for property management. It's how I've been keeping this place afloat since your daddy died. Someone had to. Does Nora know? My mother doesn't need to worry about financial details. That's what I'm here for." There it was again. My mother. I went inside. Nora was in the front room, crossword on her lap. I knelt down next to her chair and said, "Nora, did Vernon tell you he sold timber rights on the back 40? She looked confused. Timber? She didn't know. Vernon had power of attorney, and he'd been making moves behind her back for years. I told her about the $87,000, about the account, about the logging company. Her face went through about 4 emotions in 10 seconds. Confusion, then recognition, then something like embarrassment, and then this quiet, cold anger I'd only seen in her once before. At my grandfather's brother's funeral, when somebody said something about Cecil's drinking, she said, "Get Vernon." I went to the porch. He was still sitting there. I said, "Nora wants to talk to you."
He came inside, and he stood in the doorway of the front room, and he looked at Nora, and for about 3 seconds, nothing happened. She just stared at him. And then she started to speak, but her voice caught. Not from emotion, exactly. More from not knowing which of the 10 things she wanted to say should come first. She stopped, took a breath, and then said, "You sold my trees, Vernon." Vernon got defensive. He raised his voice, which he almost never did in front of her. He said the property was falling apart, and somebody had to pay for it, and he'd been carrying this family since Dale died, and nobody appreciated what he'd sacrificed. And then he turned to me and said, and this one I remember word for word, "You want to talk about what's fair, Karen? You're not even a real part of this family. Your daddy was a question mark, and you're the footnote. So go back to your little hammer and nail business and let the actual Wallers handle Waller land." Footnote. He called me a footnote. Paulette was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. She didn't say a word, but I saw her hands. She was gripping the door frame so hard her knuckles had gone white. Now here's where I need to pause, because what I did next, or I guess what I didn't do, is the part I still think about. I should have fought back. I should have said something devastating. But what I actually did was pick up my keys, walk out the front door, and drive home. I didn't cry until I was on New Circle Road. And then I cried so hard I had to pull into a gas station parking lot and sit there with the engine running for 20 minutes. But first, that night, something happened that I wouldn't learn about for another year. After the confrontation, Vernon went into damage control mode. And when I say damage control, I don't mean he apologized or tried to smooth things over. I mean he doubled down. Over the next few months, I started losing clients. Not a flood, a trickle. A kitchen renovation in Hamburg that was supposed to start in August. The homeowner called and said they'd decided to go in a different direction. A referral from a realtor I'd worked with 3 times suddenly dried up. A commercial bid I was a shoo-in for, a restaurant build-out on Limestone, went to a company out of Georgetown that underbid me by $22,000, which made no sense unless someone was subsidizing them or someone had told the owner not to trust me. I'm not paranoid, but I'm not stupid either. Lexington's construction community isn't that big. And when I finally asked the realtor, Beth Ann, she got quiet and said, "Karen, I like you, but someone's been saying things.
What things? That you've got financial issues. That there was some kind of family dispute about a property and you were trying to leverage an inheritance you weren't entitled to. That you might not be who you say you are. Vernon hadn't just lied to the family. He'd taken the lie into the professional community. He was poisoning my reputation with the same story. That I wasn't a real Waller. That my claim was fraudulent. That I was some kind of opportunist trying to steal family land. The man insured half the horse farms in the county. He knew everyone. He played golf with developers. He donated to the right charities. He showed up at every Chamber of Commerce breakfast with that big laugh and that firm handshake. And he was using that network to choke my business. Ugh. I lost 4 contracts that fall. Waller Built went from 6 active jobs to 2. I had to let one of my guys go, Marcus, who'd been with me for 3 years and had a baby daughter. I couldn't look at him when I told him. He was erasing me, and I let him. That December, Nora had a fall, broke her hip in the bathroom. She was 83. Vernon called me from Baptist Health, same hospital where my dad died, and his voice was strange, controlled, but tight. He said, "Your grandmother's in surgery. You should probably come." Probably. Like it was optional. I went. And in the waiting room, while Vernon was on the phone with the insurance company, and Trent was getting coffee from the vending machine, Paulette sat down next to me. She looked exhausted, but more than that, her eyes had this bruised quality, the skin underneath dark and thin. She looked like she hadn't slept well in years and had stopped trying to hide it. She asked how my business was doing, and I said something about it being a slow season. She nodded and picked at a thread on her sleeve. Then she was telling me about the hospital food, how the cafeteria jello was the same color as the floor, and mid-sentence, she said, very quietly, almost like the words slipped out sideways. She kept everything, you know, Nora. Every piece of paper Cecil ever signed. Every document. It's all still there.
She blinked, like she'd surprised herself. Before I could ask what she meant, Vernon came around the corner, and Paulette stood up fast, smoothing her pants, already reaching for her purse. She walked away, and Vernon sat down in the chair she'd been in, looked at me, and said, "She's going to be fine." The doctor said the surgery went well. He didn't ask how I was. He just sat there, legs spread wide, taking up space the way he always did. And I thought, Paulette knows something. Now let me ask you this. If someone in your family, someone married to the person hurting you, dropped a hint like that, what would you do? Would you go looking for whatever she was pointing at? Or would you wait? Because I didn't go looking. Not yet. And what happened next involved a lawyer, a filing cabinet, and a family meeting that ended with a knife hitting a cutting board. Tell me in the comments, would you have gone searching? Nora came home from the hospital in January. She was slower after the hip, needed a walker. Vernon hired a home aide, a woman from a local agency, and for a while, things got quiet. I spent the first 3 months of that year rebuilding. Smaller jobs, bathroom remodels, deck repairs, a garage conversion in Chevy Chase, bread and butter work. Not glamorous, but it kept Waller Built alive. I brought Marcus back part-time in March, and that was the first good thing in months. I also did something I should have done years earlier. I hired a lawyer. Her name's not important. I'll just call her my attorney. She was a property lawyer out of Frankfurt, recommended by a contractor friend. I sat in her office for 90 minutes and laid out everything. The power of attorney, the timber sale, the account in Vernon's name, the whisper campaign against my business. She listened. She took notes. And when I finished, she leaned back and said, "I've seen 3 of these this year alone. Family property, aging parent, 1 sibling running the show." She shook her head. The entitlement always looks the same. Then she got specific. The timber sale is a problem. If he made that transaction without Lenora's informed consent, that's a potential breach of fiduciary duty. But it's hard to prove what an 83-year-old woman did or didn't consent to, especially when the POA is valid on its face. She said the stronger play was the property itself. If Nora died without a will, or with a will Vernon had influenced, the distribution would follow Kentucky intestate law, which would split things between her surviving children. Vernon, as an adopted child, had the same legal standing as a biological child. I sat with that for a minute. So even if the lie is a lie, even if my dad was the biological son, it doesn't matter legally? In terms of inheritance? Adoption confers full legal rights. So no, biologically speaking, it wouldn't change Vernon's legal claim. But, she said, it would change everything about his authority. His entire position in this family is built on the idea that he's the real Waller and your father wasn't. If that's inverted, if he is the adopted one, his moral leverage disappears. And moral leverage in family disputes is often more powerful than legal standing. She paused. And I have to ask you something you might not want to hear. Have you considered, even for a moment, that Vernon might be partially right? About your father? My stomach tightened. No, I'm not saying he is. But if we go down this road, we need to be prepared for whatever the documents say. I understood. And I hated that she'd asked. But she was right to ask. The lie wasn't a legal weapon. It was an emotional one. Vernon had used blood to justify every decision he'd made for 19 years. Take that away, and the whole structure collapses. But I didn't have proof. Not yet. This story is bigger than I thought it would be when I started telling it. If it's hitting close to home for you, just tap subscribe so you don't lose this. I thought about what Paulette had said in the hospital waiting room. She kept everything, you know. Nora. Every piece of paper. And I thought about what Nora had said on the porch that Sunday in 2016. Have you been in my bedroom closet? The closet. The papers. Paulette knowing about them. I didn't go searching. Not because I wasn't curious, but Nora was still alive, still in that house, and I wasn't going to sneak through her things like I was the one with something to hide. Instead, I waited. On the drive home, I took the long way, down Old Frankfort Pike, past the farm. The back pasture was visible from the road, and I slowed down when I saw it. Stumps where the black walnuts had been, tire ruts through the south meadow, a stack of cut logs by the fence line, half covered with a tarp that had blown loose. It looked like a wound. The land my grandfather had kept whole for 40 years, carved open for $87,000 that went into Vernon's pocket. You know what's funny? The man who spent 19 years claiming he was the real Waller by blood was the one selling off the land piece by piece. And the mouth that opened, I never would have guessed it would be Paulette's. The week before the meeting, Nora had told Vernon she wanted to have a family meeting about the property. She said she'd been thinking about what would happen to the land after she was gone. She wanted everything on the table. Vernon agreed immediately, which should have been my first clue that he'd already prepared for this. The meeting was set for October 17th, a Tuesday, at the farmhouse. 7 o'clock. Kitchen table. I got there at 6:45. The kitchen smelled like Paulette's cornbread. She always made it when there was family business. Like feeding people would soften whatever was coming. The table was the same oak slab that had been in that kitchen since my grandparents built the house. I'd eaten cereal at that table as a 5-year-old. Nora was already sitting at the head. She had a glass of sweet tea and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked tired, but focused. Vernon sat to her left. Trent was next to him. 29. Insurance license, just like his dad. Same build, same loud voice, but without Vernon's cunning. Trent wasn't cruel. He was just oblivious. He'd grown up being told he was the heir, and he believed it the way you believe the sun comes up. Paulette was at the counter, cutting the cornbread into squares.
She hadn't sat down. I took the chair across from Vernon. For a minute, nobody said anything. Vernon talked about a storm that had taken shingles off the barn roof, the insurance adjuster who hadn't returned his calls. Trent laughed at something. Paulette asked if anyone wanted more tea. The nothing talk that fills a room when everyone knows something heavy is coming. Nora let it go on for a bit. Then she took off her reading glasses, set them on the table, and said, "All right." The room went quiet. She said she'd been talking to her own lawyer. First I'd heard of that. And she wanted to discuss a new will. She said the current will, drafted in 2012, left the property to Vernon as primary beneficiary with a life estate for herself. She said she wanted to change it. Vernon's face didn't move, but his hand, the one resting on the table, I watched his fingers curl inward, just slightly. "Change it how, Mama?" "I want to split it. 50-50. Vernon and Karen." The room got very still. Trent looked at his dad. Vernon looked at Nora. And then Vernon did what Vernon always does. He reached for the lie. "Mama, we've talked about this. Karen is Dale's girl. And Dale, we've been over this. There are questions about Dale's parentage, about whether Cecil was really—" "Vernon." Nora's voice was quiet, but it had an edge I'd never heard before. "Don't." He kept going, because Vernon couldn't help himself. The lie was load-bearing. Without it, his entire position in that house, on that land, at that table, it all depended on everyone believing that Dale Waller was not a real Waller. The people who lie loudest are usually the ones most terrified of silence. "Mama, I'm not trying to be hurtful, but the reality is, Dale was different. You and Daddy always treated him different, and I think we both know why." Nora closed her eyes, and I sat there, watching my 84-year-old grandmother get bulldozed by her own son at her own table, and I couldn't speak. All those years of hearing the lie, and still watching him say it to her face, in her kitchen. I froze. That's when Trent said, "Dad's right, Grandma. It's complicated. And Karen's great, but she's not really, you know." He shrugged, like my entire identity was a footnote he couldn't be bothered to read. Paulette was standing at the counter with a knife in her hand and a square of cornbread she'd stopped cutting mid-slice. The overhead light was buzzing, that faint electrical hum old fluorescents make. I could see Nora's hands on the table, the veins standing up under thin skin. The cornbread was getting cold. Nobody was going to eat it. And Vernon, sensing he was winning, went for the kill. He leaned forward, put his hand on Nora's arm, and said, softly, like a prayer,
"Mama, Dale wasn't Cecil's son. We all know it. And Karen isn't a Waller. I'm sorry, but pretending otherwise isn't fair to anyone, especially not to the actual family that's been here, taking care of you every single day." I found out later, months later, from Paulette herself, what made that moment different from all the others. It wasn't just the lie again. It was Nora. Paulette told me she looked at Nora's face when Vernon said those words, and she saw an 84-year-old woman who might not live to see another October, too tired to fight back. And Paulette thought, if she dies with this lie still standing, it becomes the truth. She'd kept quiet for 8 years imagining there'd be a better moment, and she realized there wouldn't be. That's when the knife hit the cutting board. Right now, someone in that kitchen is about to say something that will rearrange every lie Vernon ever told. The room is silent. The faucet is dripping, and Paulette's hands are shaking. What do you think she's about to say? Tell me in the comments, and stay right here, because the next part is the moment everything breaks open. It wasn't a slam. It was a drop. Paulette just let go of the knife, and it clattered against the board and then the counter, and the sound was sharp enough that everyone turned. Paulette was shaking. Not her hands, her whole body. Like something inside her had been bolted down for years and the bolts had just sheared off. Paulette. Vernon's voice was flat, a warning. She didn't look at him. She looked at Nora, and she said, I can't do this anymore. Vernon stood up. Paulette, sit down. No. It was the smallest word, but the way she said it, like she'd been practicing it in her head for a decade and had finally found the breath to push it out. I found them, Vernon. I found them 8 years ago. The kitchen went dead silent. Even the faucet, the one that always dripped, seemed to stop. I was looking for the extra set of car keys. In your office, the filing cabinet, bottom drawer, and I found the envelope. Vernon's face changed. It was fast, maybe half a second, but I saw it. The color left his cheeks like someone had pulled a drain plug. What envelope? Trent asked. Paulette kept her eyes on Vernon. The manila envelope with his original birth certificate, his adoption certificate, dated April 3rd, 1964, adopted by Cecil and Lenora Waller at 11 days old, through Catholic Charities of Louisville. Nobody moved. Dale was the biological child. Dale was Cecil's son. Dale was the real Waller. Her voice cracked on my father's name. And you, Vernon, you were adopted. You were the one they chose. They chose you. And this is what you did with it. Vernon grabbed the edge of the table. Paulette, you don't know what you're talking about. I held the certificate in my hands. I read every word. I know your birth mother's name. It was Ruth Ann Combs. She was 17 years old. She was from Shelby County. You want me to keep going? Trent was staring at his father. His mouth was open, but nothing was coming out. And Nora had both hands flat on the table and she was crying. Silently, tears running down her face and onto the oak. You knew? I said to Nora. She nodded. You knew this whole time? I wanted to protect him, she whispered. Cecil and I, we promised each other. Vernon would never have to know. It was supposed to be a kindness. A kindness. I heard my own voice, and I barely recognized it. He spent 19 years telling everyone I wasn't family. He poisoned my business. He called my father a question mark. And you let him? To protect him? I need to tell you what Vernon looked like in that moment, because I don't ever want to forget it. He was standing, both hands on the table, and his face was crumbling. Not dramatically, not like a movie, more like watching plaster crack on an old wall. Piece by piece, the jaw loosened, the eyes went flat. The confidence, that bulletproof Vernon Waller confidence, just dissolved. And for half a second, I swear, just half a second, I saw something underneath it. Terror. Not anger, not defiance. Pure, little kid terror. The terror of a man who'd spent his entire life overcompensating for a truth he sensed, but never confirmed. Then it was gone. His face hardened again, and he said, This doesn't change anything legally. I'm still a Waller. Adoption is... Oh, shut up, Vernon! That was me. My own voice. I didn't plan it. It just came out. Shut up. For once in your life, shut up. He shut up. Paulette was still standing at the counter. She was crying now, too, but her back was straight. 8 years she'd carried this. Through every Thanksgiving where Vernon told the lie. Through every time he called me a footnote. Through every time he said, my mother. Like he owned Nora by blood and I was the imposter. Why now? I asked her. She looked at me, wiped her face with the back of her hand. Because he was about to do it again. And I'm tired. I am so... God, Karen. I am so tired of watching him do this to you. The faucet dripped. Once, twice, 3 times. Nobody else said a word. I don't know how long we sat there. Felt like an hour. Might have been 10 minutes. Trent was the first one to move. He pushed his chair back and walked out the kitchen door. Not the front door, the back one, onto the porch. I heard the screen door slap shut behind him. The same screen door my father fixed. Vernon was still standing. He hadn't sat back down. He looked smaller. I know that sounds strange for a man his size, but something structural had been removed, and the frame didn't know how to hold itself up anymore. Nora spoke first. Her voice was thick but steady. "Vernon, I love you. You are my son. Cecil loved you. We never once regretted bringing you into this family." She took a breath. "But what you did to Dale's name, to Dale's daughter, that was wrong. And I should have stopped it. I was so afraid you'd find out about the adoption that I let you destroy your brother's legacy to keep the secret safe. And that is something I will answer for." Vernon opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You should have told me," he said, and his voice was stripped, like someone had sanded off every layer of performance, and what was left was just a man who didn't know who he was. "Yes," Nora said. "I should have." He walked out. Same back door as Trent. I heard his truck start a few minutes later. Paulette sat down at the table for the first time all night. She looked at Nora, then at me. "I'm sorry it took me so long." I wanted to be angry at her. Part of me was. 8 years of silence while Vernon demolished my reputation and rewrote my father's history. But I looked at her face, the relief, the exhaustion, the fear of what she'd just done to her own marriage, and I couldn't hold on to the anger. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. Imperfect as it was, late as it was, she'd done the thing nobody else had the guts to do. I drove home. The roads were dark, October dark. No streetlights once you get past Man o' War Boulevard. I pulled into my driveway and sat there with the engine off. The house was quiet when I went inside. I put my keys on the counter and stood in my kitchen, the small one, the rental, the one with the linoleum floor and the window that doesn't seal right, and the stillness hit me. It was over. After 19 years, it was actually over. But it didn't feel like winning. It felt like something had been cut open and everything was spilling out at once. Not just Vernon's lie, Nora's silence. All those years she knew the truth and watched him say those things about my father and chose to protect the secret instead of the memory. She'd loved Vernon. I believe that. But she'd let my father become a question mark to keep Vernon comfortable. I didn't cry. I just stood there with both hands on the counter, breathing, until the clock on the microwave said 11:37. Truth costs everything, but you pay it once. I called my attorney, left a voicemail at 11:40 p.m. I said, "We need to talk about the power of attorney, and the timber sale, and a new will." She called me back at 7:15 the next morning. The whisper campaign stopped first. Within weeks of that kitchen night, the phone calls about my financial issues dried up. I don't know if someone noticed Vernon had gone quiet, or if word just traveled the way it does in a town where everybody knows everybody's insurance agent, but it stopped before any legal papers were filed. The formal stuff took longer. Within 2 weeks, Nora revoked Vernon's power of attorney at the attorney's office in Frankfurt, with a notary and 2 witnesses. Vernon was served by certified mail. He didn't contest it. I think by then, even he knew the ground under him had shifted permanently. Nora's new will, drafted that same month, split the property equally between Vernon and me, with Paulette given a life estate in the farmhouse for as long as she wanted it. Trent was named in the will, but received no land. Vernon's share would pass to him eventually. The timber sale money, the $87,000, that took the longest. My attorney filed a formal demand for an accounting. Vernon's lawyer went back and forth for 2 months before the money was returned to the property's operating account. All of it, eventually. Meanwhile, Beth Ann, the realtor, called me in February with a referral. Then another one in March. By April, Wallerbilt had 5 active jobs again. Marcus came back full-time. I saw Trent at a gas station sometime in there. maybe late February. He was filling up his truck and I was walking out with a coffee. He looked at me, and I could see him working through something. The face of a man who'd spent his whole life standing next to his father's version of the family, and was now trying to figure out what was real and what was scaffolding. He said, "Hey, Karen." Quiet. Not offhand, the way he used to say it. This was careful, like he was saying my name for the first time and wanted to get it right. I said, "Hey, Trent," and that was it. But it was different. Nora passed away the following September. She was 85, died in her sleep, in the stone farmhouse, in the bedroom she'd shared with Cecil for 34 years. I got the call at 5 a.m. from Paulette. She sounded calm, tired but calm. She said, "Karen, she's gone." She went peaceful. I drove out to the farm. The sun was just coming up over the pasture and the light was hitting the white fencing in that way it does in central Kentucky when the air's still clean from the night. Vernon was there. He'd come from his apartment. He and Paulette had separated after the kitchen night. He was standing by his truck in the driveway, not moving toward the house. I walked past him. He said, "Karen." I stopped. "She loved you," he said. "She loved Dale. And she loved me, even knowing. She loved all of us." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and went inside. The funeral was 3 days later at a church on Harrodsburg Road. Nora had specified everything in advance. Hymns, readings, who'd carry the casket. The whole county came. Vernon sat in the front row. I sat in the front row. We didn't speak. After the burial, my attorney handled the estate. The will was clear. The property split cleanly. Front 37 acres to Vernon, back 37 acres, and the farmhouse to me. Paulette kept her life estate. The boarding stable lease transferred to my name. The first thing I did on my own land was check the fencing on the back pasture, my dad's territory. The posts he'd set, the wire he'd strung. Most of it was still good. One section near the creek had rotted through, and I replaced it myself on a Saturday morning in October while the mist was still sitting on the grass. I framed that section like I frame a house. Level, plumb, solid. And when I drove the last post into the ground, I thought about Dad, his red toolbox, his Saturday mornings, his hands that looked just like mine. I thought about Nora saying, "Don't let Vernon in my closet." About Paulette gripping the doorframe. About 8 years of silence. And one kitchen night when a woman decided she'd had enough. I went into Nora's bedroom closet after the estate settled. I found a shoebox on the top shelf, tucked behind a stack of quilts. Inside, Vernon's adoption certificate, the original, not a copy. Cecil and Lenora's marriage certificate, Dale's birth certificate, born at Good Samaritan Hospital, October 11th, 1959. Parents Cecil Allen Waller and Lenora May Waller. And a letter, handwritten, Nora's handwriting, small, neat, slightly shaky. It said, "To whoever finds this, Vernon is my son. Dale was my son. Both of them. The papers don't make one more real than the other, but lies do damage, and I waited too long to stop the damage. Forgive me." I put the letter back in the shoebox. I put the shoebox back on the shelf. Some things don't need to go to court. Some things just need to be known. It's been almost 2 years now. I'm sitting on the back porch of the farmhouse, my farmhouse, writing permits on a Saturday morning. There's a cup of coffee on the railing and a blue jay arguing with itself in the walnut tree that Vernon's logging company didn't get to. The air smells like cut grass because Marcus came out yesterday to help me with the south fence line. He's full-time with Waller Built again. We've got 8 active jobs, including a historic barn restoration in Mercer County that I'm probably more excited about than a grown woman should be. Paulette stops by on Sundays. She brings cornbread. We eat it on the porch, and sometimes we don't talk about anything important, and sometimes we talk about Nora or Dale or the kitchen night. She filed for divorce in January. It's not final yet, but she's living in a little apartment in Georgetown, and she seems lighter, like someone removed a stone from her chest she'd been carrying so long she forgot it was there. Trent called me last month, first time since everything happened. He said he'd been thinking, and he wanted to know more about Dale. About the real Dale, not Vernon's version. I told him about the toolbox and the Saturday mornings and the screen door. I told him his grandfather Cecil was a good man who chose to love a boy who wasn't his by blood and never once treated him like less. Trent said, "Dad never told me any of that." I said, "I know. Vernon. I see him around. Lexington's not big enough to avoid someone forever. He's still selling insurance, still has the big laugh, still claps people on the shoulder too hard. But something's different. He's quieter at family events. There aren't many anymore. He came to the property once, about 6 months ago, to pick up equipment he'd left in the barn. He stood in the driveway for a while, looking at the farmhouse. I didn't go out. Not because I was angry, just because there was nothing left to say. So, listen, if you made it all the way to the end of this story, I want to say something to you directly, and I mean it. Thank you. I know that was a long one. I know some of those parts were hard to sit through. They were hard to live through, so hearing them probably wasn't easy either. The fact that you stayed means something to me. This story, Nora's silence, Vernon's lie, Paulette's courage, it sat inside me for years. And I think the reason I finally decided to tell it is because I realized it wasn't just mine. Everybody's got a Vernon. Maybe not exactly. Maybe yours doesn't steal timber rights or rewrite your father's history. But everybody's got someone who decided who you are and told the world before you could speak for yourself. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think about your own family or your own truth, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And leave a like, because that's how more people find stories like this. And I think some people really need to. I've got a question for you. And it's not rhetorical. I actually want to know. Is there someone in your life who rewrote your story? And did you ever get to set the record straight? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. And if you want more stories like this, real ones, messy ones, the kind that don't wrap up in a neat little bow, there's plenty more on this channel. Just click and I'll be right here. My name is Karen Waller. I build houses, and I live on 74 acres off Old Frankfort Pike. Half of it mine by will, all of it mine by blood, and the faucet still drips. I haven't fixed it yet. I kind of like the sound.